Peace, Love, Liberty Radio version 4.0. Prepare for launch.
OTC is go.
Packetbus is go.
PTC is go.
LPS is go.
Houston flight is go.
Pilot go.
STM is go.
Safety comms is go.
STU is go.
LRD is go. SRO is go.
CDI is go.
Launch Director, NTD, our launch team is ready to proceed at this time.
99, proceeded, 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston.
Consequences so severe, so pull your trigger quickly, dear. Our patriots are acting up, let's punish them with fear. Hey, hey!
Hey, welcome to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. I am your host, Darryl W. Perry, and you know, I'm going to do something a little bit different today. Today is not going to be a version 4.0 of Peace, Love, Liberty Radio, and it's also definitely not the Ask Me Anything, because today is not Wednesday. Today, however, is Independence Day. It's the 4th of July, and so I'm going to do a Secession edition of Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. And why Secession, you may ask? Well, you know, you may have forgotten that that's actually what happened when the 13 colonies declared their independence from Great Britain, specifically from the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And, well, I was at a secession conference, actually somewhat of a secession conference over the weekend. It was the first ever Startup Societies Summit, and there were some secessionists there. There were other people that were there that were trying to create autonomous regions within existing countries and not necessarily trying to declare independence from the new region. One of these being a representative from the Honduras ZED, the Economic Development Zone. And the reason it's called a Z instead of an EDZ is because, well, in Honduras they speak Spanish, and so it's Zona Economic something Developmentio or something along those lines. So, you know, like the Z comes first, but it's a special economic development zone. And the point there is to work within the existing structure to have this sort of freer community. And then there were also representatives from Liberland or Liberland, depending on how you wish to pronounce it, which is a micronation of sorts in Europe, where they're trying to claim ownership and possession of a piece of land that the Croatian government does not claim for themselves. The Croats actually say, this land is Serbia's. And Serbia's like, it's not ours. But, you know, so basically nobody is currently living there. People have tried to go there, but the Croatian government has prevented people from going onto land that the Croatian government does not claim to own, which is rather strange indeed. There were also people at the summit that were talking about building decentralized things to basically make the state obsolete. The state being that monopoly organization that claims a legitimate use of violence. So let's now talk about actually secession. And I've got an article here written by Joe Jarvis, who was at the Startup Society Summit. He was actually one of the volunteers. I believe he was also a co-organizer of the event. But he wrote this article several weeks ago titled The Moral Case for Secession. And if you're a subscriber to FPP News, the actual physical newspaper, this article is published in that newspaper. But again, because it's the 4th of July, it is Independence Day, and I used air quotes there when I said that because, you know, like the United States government, yes, technically independent from Great Britain, but still heavily dependent on other nations, you know, as part of various trade agreements and various other sort of, you know, like binding binding treaties such as, you know, the United Nations. And I understand that there are some libertarians that are like, well, as long as the United States exists, and as long as governments exist, it makes sense for the U.S. to be involved in the UN because it allows us to have trade with other countries, and it allows us to, talk to other countries and be diplomatic. Well, not everybody needs to be a member of the UN, and for a long time, Switzerland was not even a member of the United Nations. But I don't think anybody would say that Switzerland did not have diplomatic relations with the rest of the world. Quite the contrary. The Swiss government is doing a mighty fine job of not intervening in the world's affairs, even though they are now a member of the UN. But again, for a long time, they were not. And, I'm not here to discuss the validity or invalidness of the United Nations, but I want to talk about secession. And what is the moral case for secession? Well, secession, first and foremost, is a natural right. Morality is what is naturally right and wrong. Saying someone has a right is a statement about an individual's condition in nature, absent other parties. That is why rights are expressed in the negative, because a right is a declaration of the natural state of a human, and the assertion that another human that disrupts this natural right is in the wrong. Therefore, there is only one natural right from which all other rights stem: self-ownership. Self-ownership means only the individual gets to decide what happens with his or her own body. Self-ownership condemns non-consensual interference with another person's body. In reference to human interaction, in nature, an individual is at peace until acted upon by an outside force. Whoever wields that force is morally and naturally in the wrong. Justice is when a person who is morally in the wrong is held to account for their transgression of an individual's right. And this is me breaking in here. So basically, the concept of courts are to hold people responsible, to punish them when they have violated the rights of another person. Although the vast majority of offenses now are simply offenses against the state, or as they say in New Hampshire, against the peace and dignity of the state. But I contend that the state, by its very nature, is neither peaceful nor dignified. But I digress and return to the article. Unless an individual violates the rights of another, it is immoral and unjust to violate that person's individual rights. It is a natural right of the individual to secede from a larger group because the individual owns himself and may decide what to do with his own body. There's more. Stay tuned here to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Coinbase is a simple and secure online Bitcoin wallet for sending, receiving, and storing Bitcoin. Coinbase also allows you to buy and sell Bitcoin using a bank account or use their tools to accept Bitcoin as a merchant. Coinbase has more than 1 million consumer wallets and is trusted by over 25,000 merchants, including Overstock.com, Khan Academy, Reddit, and of course, FPP. Get started at coinbase.fppradio.com. You can support FPP Radio by joining the Fans program. Fans are friends, allies, and numerary supporters. Fans help FPP afford to produce more original content. You can join the Fans program for as little as $3 per month through Patreon and get perks like ad-free versions of FPP Radio News and Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. To learn more or to join the Fans program, visit fans.fppradio.com. That's FANS.fppradio.com.
You're listening to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio with Darryl W. Perry.
Before I jump back into the article here, the moral case for secession, well, you heard me briefly talk about some of the people at the Startup Society Summit. We're talking about decentralized things to sort of replace the state, make the state irrelevant. Well, one of those things is Bitcoin. And Bitcoin has been around for, I think, about 7 years. And it's one of the most free forms of money. And it's a way that you can actually, keep your money in the free market while using free market money. And if you do that, then I'm guessing you actually wind up promoting Bitcoin as an alternative to this fiat-centric world? And if so, you need Spend-A-Bit in your arsenal. Spend-A-Bit is a search engine for things you can buy with Bitcoin. Spend-A-Bit aggregates millions of products from thousands of Bitcoin-enabled merchants, including Overstock.com and Free Press publications. Keep your money in the free economy. Spend-A-Bit. Use my affiliate link, spendabit.fppradio.com. And if you're a Bitcoin-accepting merchant, like I am, ask about their merchant suite to reach even more customers. That's spendabit.fppradio.com. Back now to the article, again written by Joe Jarvis, The Moral Case for Secession. He says it is a natural right of the individual to secede from a larger group because the individual owns himself and may decide what to do with his own body. Other individuals are not justified in stopping the existing party, since it is not a violation of anyone's state of nature to be disassociated from. The moral response to secession is to leave the individual or individuals to their own devices. And this is of utmost importance because one of the arguments that I often hear about why secession is a bad thing is because, well, secession is violent. Well, no, it doesn't have to be. And in most cases, the seceding party is not the one that actually began the violence. It is generally the larger group that is trying to prevent someone from leaving their group. It's akin to a very abusive spouse saying, you're not allowed to leave, and if I can't have you, no one can, and then proceeding to attempt to try to kill the spouse that has been abused. That's what governments do. That's what the British Crown did when the United States of America, at that time the 13 colonies, if you will, when they sent that very epic breakup letter to King George, and that's what we're celebrating today is the adoption of that breakup letter. When the colonies sent those, that breakup letter to King George was not happy, and he, promptly sent troops to try to, squash the rebellion. And how dare you? You can't leave me. If I can't have you, no one can. Abe Lincoln did the same thing after the southern states seceded. Actually, yeah, it was after, several of the southern states had seceded. Abe Lincoln, and there's, dispute over who actually wound up firing first at Fort Sumter. But by the accounts that I've read, the credible accounts that I've read, it was actually, sort of miscommunication to where each side thought the other had fired first, and so then they fired in response. And again, nobody really knows who wound up firing that first shot. But what you learn in government school is that, well, no, it was the Southern forces that fired on Fort Sumter. But, again, by all accounts that I've seen, no one really knows who fired first. But again, even if the Southerners fired first on that would, again, that's the exception, not the rule. Generally, by and large, the vast majority of the time when there is fighting from a secession, it is the larger group that initiates the conflict against the seceding party. What is next here in this article about the moral case for secession? Secession organizes property according to natural rights. So we started off by saying that secession, by its very nature, is a natural right, but secession also organizes property according to natural rights. Joe Jarvis writes, forming free market startup societies, or Geo Libres, is in essence a secessionist movement. Secession is not the elimination of a government per se, but rather the fracturing of the state into smaller states. Geo Libres seek to remove private property from state control and restructure that control under the property owners in order to form a more just society. Geo Libres are made up of voluntary groups of individuals. If government is by the people and requires the consent of the governed, The structure of a Geo Libre is the perfect government. The people who own the land all agree to start a society together. Then, as the land is inhabited, every new member of the society consents to its rules by moving there. And some people will argue that homeowners associations are a good example of this sort of voluntary society. Skipping down here a couple of paragraphs, he says, this may sound the same as saying if you don't like the country in which you were born, then you are free to leave. The difference is in how a government acts in relation to property rights. First off, government claims the administration of communal ownership of countless occupied or rather unoccupied acres within its borders, authorized only by force. That land is all claimed without accordance to original appropriation and use, which forms the basis for property rights stemming from self-ownership. If an individual occupies and uses a previously unoccupied, unused piece of land, naturally and therefore morally, the land is his. He did not violate anyone else's right of self-ownership in that action. Therefore, it is immoral to violate his rights, for instance, if he builds a cabin on quote-unquote federal land. Secondly, traditional government enforces laws on all property, even if the owners do not consent to those laws. Ignoring for a moment how government is funded, it is otherwise moral and just to enforce laws on private property when a person who owns or inhabits that property has violated another individual's rights. This is because the person who first violated the rights of another was morally in the wrong, and justice is holding them accountable for their violation. But government enforces other laws and regulations on private property which have nothing to do with natural rights and are therefore unjust and immoral because the government takes the first aggressive action and violates an individual's state of nature. There's one more item here before moving on to secession being legitimate all the way down to the individual. Stay tuned here on Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. During the 2013 Porcupine Freedom Festival, Davy Barker presented an idea for a renegade psychological experiment. Since then, he has refined his idea and put his plan and research into writing. He explains, "We aim to show the world beyond a shadow of a doubt that power corrupts absolutely and corrupt authority deserves no obedience." Authoritarian Sociopathy is available from Amazon.com, all major bookstores, and now available as an audiobook. Are you tired of governments murdering people around the world? Stop using their money. There is an alternative. Bitcoin is a stateless, free market, non-political currency. Bitcoin cannot be inflated or controlled by any government. By using their money, you are helping the state. Stop doing it. You have an incredible alternative available now. Learn it, use it, spread it. Get started with Bitcoin at weusecoins.com. That's weusecoins.com.
You're listening to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio, online at fppradio.com.
So, if you don't like it, leave. That's the argument that you hear all the time. And then when somebody does try to leave, people will always say, well, you can't leave to avoid, fill in the blank reason. Well, no, actually, I should have the right to leave, but you do not have the right to force things on me to which I do not consent, because that by its very nature is immoral. We're discussing the moral case for secession, and let me sort of explain how Geo Libres, and I'm just going to recap here what I touched on at the end of the last segment. Geo Libres, which are sort of intentional communities of sorts, to where everybody consents to what is happening. Some people will say, well, how's that different from what it is now? Well, first and foremost, governments claim the administration of communal ownership of unoccupied land, whereas in a Geo Libre, the rules that apply only apply to occupied. So if there's unoccupied land that nobody is claiming, you would be able to basically go homestead that land, and you have the right to do that as long as you don't interfere with somebody else's rights. Secondly, traditional governments enforce laws on all property, even if the owners do not consent to those laws. and they try to enforce all kinds of things in which there is no actual wrongdoing, to where, they'll say, you're not allowed to have this plant, you're not allowed to consume this plant, you're not allowed to possess this drink or whatever, what have you. But in a Geo Libre, you can have whatever plant you want as long as you're not causing harm to another person. And finally, governments fund all of their services through taxation, which must be considered immoral and unjust since it is a non-consensual aggression, which carries violent consequences if an individual refuses to pay. Rights have been violated in order to acquire the funds which governments use to carry out every function. This means government, as it currently stands, is not justified in owning any land nor enforcing any laws, since enforcement first requires the violation of rights. If funding was voluntarily acquired, however, it would be just to enforce only crimes with victims. In contrast, Geo Libres solve this problem of consent. You must obey the rules of an individual's private property, and an individual cannot place rules on another person's private property, nor claim administrative privileges of property that is already in use by another person. But to reiterate, morally, true justice, as in holding a rights violator accountable for his actions, may be served on private land regardless of whether the property owner agrees or not. Secession is valid all the way down to the individual. And this is something that I have advocated for a long time, is I should have the right to declare myself the Free State of Darryl. The Free State of Darryl is a 3-foot radius around my person, so basically my personal space. That is the Free State of Darryl. However, most people do not recognize my claim of independence as valid because they say, well, if you don't want to be an American, then you need to leave the country and jump through all these legal hoops and hurdles and then hope that another country will let you stay where you are. But I should not have to leave where I currently am. As long as I'm not violating the rights of another person, I've not committed any sort of wrongdoing, so I should be able to secede, right? Well, Joe Jarvis seems to agree. He says if an individual owns land, he is free to be a government of one. I disagree with his statement here that you must own land in order to be a government of one, but let's just, set that aside and continue. He says even if an individual does not own land, he is free to be a government of one on any previously unclaimed, unused land, which he then owns by being the first to claim and use. When he voluntarily enters land owned by others, however, he must obey the rules set forth by the property owner. There must be consensus in government for it to be moral and just, and when a larger group cannot come to an agreement, the only moral course of action is to allow the group to fracture until the agreements can be had in all the subgroups. If an individual cannot come to terms with the group, he is also morally free to separate. Even within the confines of a Geo Libre, that is an intentional community, is it not moral, or rather it is not moral, to dictate what non-aggressive actions can be done on one's own property? If the Geo Libre was formed with land in common, then the rules set forth by the communal owners of that land must be followed. But this association cannot morally kick someone off of their own land simply because that land falls within the confines of the Geo Libres, assuming the individual did not agree to specific terms when purchasing the land within the confines of the Geo Libre. Consent, however, is necessary for all moral interactions, and an individual disassociating from others is no violation of natural morality. People are morally free to associate or disassociate peacefully if they do not get along. Most people find others they share similar beliefs and visions with, and therefore voluntarily team up. They may not agree all the time, but if they see value in the partnership, all of their decisions will be consensus, or rather will be by consensus. As the alternative is going their separate ways, As soon as consensus is not reached, smaller groups can then secede. There's one final section to this article here about the moral case for secession, and I will get into that in the closing moments of this Independence Day episode of Peace, Love, Liberty Radio, as always online at fppradio.com. In 1999, Darryl W. Perry began a search for traditional values, which led him down a path to the ideas of liberty. He tells the story in A Rebel's Journey, My Path to Liberty. Of the book, Dr. Brian Sovereign says, sometimes it's funny, and sometimes I think it's crazy, but it's always authentic. Find A Rebel's Journey, My Path to Liberty by Darryl W. Perry on Facebook, read reviews on Amazon, ask for A Rebel's Journey wherever books are sold, or visit arebelsjourney.com.
It is the year 91,001 BCE. Witness humanity's origins in Hyperchronius, a classic role-playing game for Windows PCs, with a story like no other game before. A liberty-oriented experience that is not to be missed. Go to zog.ninja to get your copy of Hyperchronius today. Use the code FPP to get $1 off. Hyperchronius, zog.ninja, code FPP.
This is Jeremy Scott, host of Dark 30. You're listening to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio with Darryl W. Perry.
Hey, it's the closing moments here on Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. The Secession edition, because today is July 4th. Today is the day that most people think that the colonies seceded from Great Britain. And in point of fact, it's the day that the Declaration of Independence was ratified, but Independence Day is properly July 2nd. That's the day that the Continental Congress actually approved a resolution saying, we intend to leave. So July 2nd is actually Independence Day, but most people celebrate July 4th. And again, a lot of people don't really understand why they're celebrating, and they don't think of American independence as being a secession, but that's exactly what it was. So I'm going through the moral case for secession. Article written by Joe Jarvis, and as I mentioned earlier, this article is in the July issue of FPP News, the physical newspaper that I publish once a month. You can subscribe at news.fpp.cc. That's news.fpp.cc, as in Creative Commons. Secession is moral, and stopping secession is unjust. The only form, or rather the only moral form of government is by complete consent of all governed. Geo Libres, free market startup societies, organize in this fashion. They are formed on private property that has been acquired without aggression and do not force any rules on anyone except what participants voluntarily agree to. Otherwise, self-ownership, the natural law which dictates morality, is the only tenet. Governments have no right to keep those in their system without consent. This is a violation of individual rights. Even if the majority consents, this does not make consent for the individual. And the great lie that we're told is that governments exist with the consent of the governed. However, they say, and this is me speaking, not reading the article, they, that being, those in power, those who believe in the state, will say that your existence within the territory that they claim is your consent, but I disagree. I think that in order to consent, it must be expressed consent. It can't be this implied of, well, you're at the end of my fist, so therefore you consent to me beating you up. An individual human in his natural state is free and unharmed. Therefore, it is morally wrong for another human to non-consensually disrupt this natural state, and it is just to punish the aggressor in any human interaction. Startup societies must be free to break away from larger governments in order to form a peaceful, voluntary society of individuals' own choosing. This is the next giant leap forward for mankind, a world where people are truly self-governed down to the individual.
The podcasts of FPP Radio are licensed under Copyright. We believe that copying is a form of flattery and do not abide by the copyright laws. Those laws serve to restrict the flow of ideas, which no one can really own. Copying is an act of love. Love is not subject to law. If you enjoy the show, consider joining the Fans program and get perks like ad-free versions of Peace, Love, Liberty Radio and FPP Radio News. To learn more or to join the Fans program, visit fans.fppradio.com.